Shall we continue? Tommy, wearing his grey pants and a white shirt that had Tommy stitched on it in red. Well, they had all lived through it. This morning, Tommy drove slowly to the town of Carlisle for errands. It was a sunny Saturday in May, and his wife's 82nd birthday was just a few days away. All around him were open fields, the corn newly planted, and the soybeans too. A number of fields were still brown, as they'd been ploughed under for their planting, but mostly there was the high blue sky with a few white clouds scattered near the horizon. He drove past the sign on the road that led down to the Barton home. It still said sewing and alterations, even though the woman, Lydia Barton, who did the sewing and alterations, had died many years ago. The Barton family had been outcasts, even in a town like Amgash, their extreme poverty and strangeness making this so. The oldest child, a man named Pete, lived alone there now. The middle child was 2 towns away, and the youngest, Lucy Barton, had fled many years ago and had ended up living in New York City. Tommy had spent time thinking of Lucy. All those years she had lingered after school, alone in a classroom, from 4th grade right up to her senior year in high school. It had taken her a few years to even look at him in the eye. But now Tommy was driving past the area where his farm had been. These days it was all fields. Not a sign of the farm was left, and he thought, as he often thought, about his life back then. It had been a good life, but he did not regret the things that had happened. It was not Tommy's nature to regret things, and on the night of the fire, in the midst of his galloping fear, he understood that all that mattered in this world were his wife and his children, and he thought that people lived their whole lives not knowing this as sharply and constantly as he did. Privately, he thought of the fire as a sign from God to keep this gift tightly to him. Privately, because he did not want to be thought of as a man who made up excuses for a tragedy, and he did not want anyone, not even his dearly beloved wife, to think he would do this. But he had felt that night, while his wife kept the children over by the road, he had rushed them from the house when he saw them, that the barn was on fire. As he watched the enormous flames flying into the nighttime sky, then heard the terrible screaming sounds of the cows as they died. He had felt many things, but it was just as the roof of his house crashed in, fell into the house itself, right into their bedrooms and the living room below, with all of the photos of the children and his parents. As he saw this happen, he had felt, undeniably, what he could only think was the presence of God, and he understood why angels had always been portrayed as having wings, because there had been a sensation of that, of a rushing sound, or not even a sound. And then it was as though God, who had no face but was God, pressed up against him and conveyed to him without words, so briefly, so fleetingly, some message that Tommy understood to be, "It's all right, Tommy." And then Tommy had understood that it was all right. It was beyond his understanding, but it was all right, and it had been. He often thought that his children had become more compassionate as a result of having to go to school with kids who were poor and not from homes like the ones they had first known. He had felt the presence of God since, at times, as though a golden colour was very near to him, but he never felt visited by God. As he had felt that night. And he knew too well what people would make of it, and this is why he would keep it to himself until his dying day, the sign from God. Still, on a spring morning, as this one was, the smell of the soil brought back to him the smells of the cows, the moisture of their nostrils, the warmth of their bellies, and his barns. He had had 2 barns, and he let his mind roll over pieces of scenes that came to him. Perhaps because he had just passed the Barton place, he thought of the man, Ken Barton, who had been the father of those poor, sad children, and who had worked on and off for Tommy, and then he thought, as he more often did, of Lucy, who had left for college and then ended up in New York City. She had become a writer. Lucy Barton. Driving, Tommy shook his head slightly. Tommy knew many things as a result of being the janitor in that school, more than 30 years. He knew of girls' pregnancies and drunken mothers and cheating spouses, for he overheard these things talked about by the students in their small huddles by the bathrooms or near the cafeteria. In many ways, he was invisible. He understood that. But Lucy Barton had troubled him the most. She and her sister Vicky and her brother Pete had been viciously scorned by the other kids, and by some of the teachers too. Yet because Lucy stayed after school so often for so many years, he felt, though she seldom spoke, that he knew her best.